Articulating learning objectives helps teachers select and organize course content. As a teacher, when you write and review the learning objectives in a lesson, you can identify the kinds of materials and topics that will be suitable to the learning outcomes most efficiently. Well-crafted objectives provide clarity for teachers to design a well-organized lesson. Before we proceed, you may subscribe for more sessions and learning. Just like a pineapple, we could not eat the whole of it. We need to chunk it by pieces so that it can be gradually taken. Like a learning competency, a child could not digest the whole of the skill or the competency unless teachers will chunk it and will be given to learners gradually. The logic is, learning competencies must be translated into smaller parts which are objectives to make it feasible and doable for learners to master the competency. If learning competencies are guided by different levels of learning and levels of assessment, learning objectives must also consider these two levels. When levels of learning and levels of assessment are incorporated in designing learning objectives, the goals become specific about what learners will achieve as a result of the work. Others can see what teachers and learners are working towards, and learners can demonstrate achievement by measuring and reporting on progress. Guided by the levels of learning and levels of assessment, learning objectives aid better communication and provide focus for efforts placed by teachers and learners over time. When breaking down the competencies to learning objectives, the learning objectives must adhere to levels of learning and assessment through the taxonomy of learning. It must be noted that learning objectives must be articulated in a way that it is sequential and progressive and must encapsulate the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains. The cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains will be translated now to knowledge, skills, and attitude. The knowledge will focus on what learners will know from the lesson. This is where key concepts are deepened to allow learners to process the details of the presentations or the discussions. The skills, however, will focus on what learners will understand from the presentations and discussions, and how will the learners apply the concepts into similar situations in real life. Attitude refers or focus on how learners put value on the knowledge gained and skills mastered out from their learning. The valuing part will wrap up how valuable the learnings are in the lives of the children. Since we are talking of competencies, we need to make sure that lessons must imbibe KSA. Competencies require sufficient knowledge, exceptional skills, and right attitude. When one is lacking from our learners, they might be growing up skillful but not competent. In other way around, they can be good but not skillful and knowledgeable. Learning in a way must be holistic. Thus, competencies require every learner to be competent at the end of the day. If one behavioral target is out of the context, then the so-called learner's competence fails. When teachers break down the competencies in their lessons, they must understand that objectives must be aligned to the target of the competencies. Learning activities must suit the learning objectives, and learning assessment must be relevant to the learning objectives and the competencies as well. Assessment must also focus on what skills the competency requires, so that outcome is targeted toward the skill requirement. These elements must be congruent and must be connected to each other. Teachers must be critical also in breaking down these elements to ensure that lessons are appropriately designed. When one element lost its proper placement, the lesson will not become smooth and target learning outcomes will not be achieved. Let us take a quick review of their definitions. Learning competencies are the main ideas or skills you expect students to master. This is what we call standard to be mastered at the end of the lesson. Learning objectives describe what the learner should be able to achieve at the end of a learning period. The competencies are broad enough that learners can be choked when taken directly. Therefore, there is a need to chunk the competencies into smaller and measurable objectives, and teachers and learners treat objectives gradually one by one. Competencies focus on the terminal skills, and objectives will help the learners achieve and master the skills. Learning objectives should be specific, measurable statements, and written in behavioral terms. Let us take a look at this example taken from one of the lesson exemplars during the document analysis and evaluation of learning activity sheets. The competency is nasasagot ang mga tanong sa binasa o napakinggang tala-arawan, journal o anekdota. The teacher breaks down the competency into the following. First, nasasagot ang mga katanungan sa nabasang journal o tala-arawan. Second, nakakasulat ng sariling tala-arawan o journal. And third is, na ibabahagi sa iba ang mga mabubuting gawain at karanasan sa pamamagitan ng tala-arawan. The question is, are these objectives properly crafted? Let us check. First objective, mali. Second objective, mali pa rin. And third objective, mali pa rin. So what is the explanation? The objectives are not written in complete behavioral terms. The first objective, focus directly on skill without targets of allowing learners to learn key concepts on answering questions based on reading of journals and anecdotes. The second reason is that lesson developer repeats the competency to become an objective. We have to remember that the competency must be chunked to be able to allow learners to digest the lesson and achieve competency targets. The second objective, as written, is not congruent to the competency requirement. The competency do not require students to write their own journal, but to answer questions from the anecdotes and journals. This competency requires reading comprehension and not writing activity. This is critical when lesson designers do not refer to competency requirements because they can require learning goals that is not congruent to the skills required by the competency. The third objective is supposedly measuring appreciation through valuing. The objective required learners to share their experiences to others through his written journal, and again, it is not the competency requirement. Supposedly, this part of the lesson will close through valuing that allow learners to appreciate the beauty of answering questions properly from the journal readings. Yet, writing and sharing is not too relevant to the competency's main idea and skills expected. So how will we improve our objectives? First, we need to write it in KSA. The knowledge objective, which is nakikilala ang mga bahagi at layunin ng tala-arawan, journal o anekdota, will allow learners to understand the purpose of journal and anecdotes so that they can get key points on how to answer questions. The second objective, which is na ipapaliwanag ang mga detalye mula sa binasang tala-arawan, journal o anekdota, will allow the learners to expand and prove their answers to be correct through explanations, as the purpose of the competency is to let the students answer the questions correctly. The third objective is na ipapahayag ang kahalagahan ng pagbibigay ng tamang sagot sa mga katanungan mula sa nabasang tala-arawan, journal o anekdota will allow the learners to express appreciation of giving right and appropriate answers from questions based from readings of journals and anecdotes. When we are going to write learning objectives, we must always remember these things. First, most essential learning competencies must not be used as objectives. Second, competencies must be broken down into objectives through KSA. And lastly, objectives must be aligned to the competency and skill requirements. We are done with the congruency of competencies and objectives. We will now take a look at the congruency of learning objectives and learning activities. Most lesson developers can interchange these elements in their lesson designs. So let us take a look first on the difference between these two elements. Learning objectives basically are again goals that learners must achieve at the end of the lesson. Learning activities are specific tasks or outputs that students must accomplish before the end of the lesson. Sometimes, teachers are making output targets or tasks as objectives. If we will make specific tasks and outputs as objectives, then we limit the skills of learners to the tasks and outputs and not anymore to the goals to be achieved and the competencies at the end of the lesson. Therefore, teachers must be very careful in determining between objectives and activities. Let us take a look again at this example. The competency is na ilalahad ang mga pangunahing paksa at ideya batay sa napakinggang usapan ng mga tauhan. The objectives are: first, nakikilala ang mga pangunahin at pantulong na kaisipang nakasaad sa binasa. Second, na ipapaliwanag ng maayos ang pansariling kaisipan, pananaw, opinyon kaugnay sa akda. And third is, nakasusulat ng sanaysay na naglalahad ng ideya tungkol sa napiling pangunahing paksa. The question again is, are these objectives properly crafted? Let us check. Number 1 is check. Number 2 is check. Number 3 is not correct. So what is the explanation? Objectives number 1 and 2 are written correctly because objective number 1 refers to knowledge and objective number 2 refers to skill. The two objectives are written in appropriate behavioral formats and targets. However, objective number 3 must shift to valuing and appreciating. Objective number 3, as written by the lesson developer, is not a learning objective but a learning activity. The writing of an essay is an activity under objective number 2, which will allow the learner to express personal opinions and ideas based on a reading text. This must not be a separate objective because the competency do not require learners to write an essay but to express personal views and opinions. Writing is just a medium to explain the opinions and ideas in details. And to revise, objective number 3 is to focus on valuing or appreciating the essence of giving right opinion based on the reading text. In that way, learners will be able to reflect and appreciate the value of the lesson. There are certain things that lesson developers must remember. First, objectives must be carefully planned. The goal for every learner must be carefully laid off. Second, learning activities must not be used as learning objectives. Learning is the process of acquiring new understanding, knowledge, behaviors, skills, values, attitudes, and preferences. Brian Herbert believed that the capacity to learn is a gift, the ability to learn is a skill, and the willingness to learn is a choice. Let us all learn together. Again, don't forget to subscribe for more sessions.